The morning Bernard Granger rode into Dusty Creek with orders to escort a woman out of the New Mexico territory. He had no idea that a single question asked at a river crossing would be the thing that undid every plan he had ever made for his life. It was the spring of 1882, and the territory of New Mexico was still a wild and breathing thing. All red canyon walls and sage-dusted flats, and a sky so enormous it made a man feel like an ant crawling across a tabletop. The railroads were pushing in from the east, and the cattle barons were pushing in from the north. And the law, such as it was, existed mostly in the form of appointed marshals and hired guns and men like Bernard Granger, who worked for the territorial court out of Santa Fe, and had the kind of reputation that made other men step back when he walked into a room. He was 31 years old, lean and brown from the sun, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and gray eyes that people often described as the color of winter clouds just before a storm. He was not a cruel man. He was not an unkind man. But he was a careful man, a man who had learned through hard experience that allowing himself to feel things too strongly was a reliable way to end up dead, broke, or both. He had been doing this work for 6 years, riding across the territory on behalf of the court, delivering summonses, collecting witnesses, escorting prisoners and witnesses and people the court needed moved from one place to another. He was good at it. He was efficient. He never got attached. His orders this time were straightforward, written on the kind of heavy cream paper that meant they came from someone important. He was to ride to Dusty Creek, collect one Cora Keating, daughter of the late Ezra Keating, and escort her to the railhead at Las Cruces, where she would board a train east to her uncle's household in St. Louis, Missouri. The territory had been declared too dangerous for an unmarried woman of her situation to remain in, following the death of her father and the disputed status of his land claim. There had been some violence in the area. There had been some threats. The court had decided, in its distant and bureaucratic wisdom, that the simplest solution was to remove the woman from the equation entirely. Bernard had received stranger orders. He folded the paper, tucked it into his vest pocket, and rode out. Dusty Creek was a town that had not yet decided whether it wanted to live or die. It had a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a small church built from adobe that was slowly returning to the earth from which it came, and about 40 permanent residents who looked at strangers with the particular wariness of people who had learned that strangers usually brought trouble. Bernard tied his horse at the post outside the general store and went inside to ask after Cora Keating. The man behind the counter, a wide-bodied fellow with a red beard named Fletcher, set down the tin of tobacco he was weighing and looked at Bernard with an expression that was equal parts caution and something that might have been pity. "You the man from the court?" Fletcher asked. "Bernard Granger," Bernard said, and showed the man his identification papers from the territorial court. Fletcher looked at the papers, then looked at Bernard, then looked at the papers again. "She's out at the Keating place," he said. "2 miles south, follow the creek bed. You'll see the cottonwoods." He paused. "She's not going to want to go." "Most people don't," Bernard said. "I'll find her." "She buried her father 3 weeks ago," Fletcher said, and his voice was quieter now. "Alone, mostly. A few of us went out to help, but she did most of the digging herself, just so you know what you're riding into." Bernard nodded, thanked the man, and rode south. He smelled the place before he saw it wood smoke and something baking, which surprised him. He had expected the hollow, abandoned feeling of a grief-soaked homestead. What he found instead was a small property that was ferociously, defiantly alive. The vegetable garden had been turned and planted. The fence line had been recently mended. There was a line of laundry drying in the warm wind, and a woman was standing on the roof of the small adobe house, apparently in the process of patching a section of crumbling clay with fresh mortar, working with the focused intensity of someone who had decided that the world would not fall apart around her if she had anything to say about it. She heard his horse and looked down. Cora Keating was 24 years old, with dark brown hair pinned somewhat precariously at the back of her neck, and dark eyes that caught the spring sunlight and held it. She was wearing a practical blue work dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hands and forearms were coated in gray mortar. She had a streak of the stuff across one cheekbone, where she must have pushed her hair back without thinking. She looked at him with an expression that was completely unimpressed, which was not the greeting Bernard had been expecting, though he could not have said exactly what he had been expecting. "If you've come to buy the land," she said, without coming down from the roof, "the answer is no. And if you've come to tell me I need to come with you, the answer is also no. So you might as well tell me who you are and what you actually want." Bernard looked up at her. "I'm Bernard Granger. I work for the territorial court out of Santa Fe." Something shifted in her face, not fear exactly, more a kind of bracing, the way a person looks when they have been expecting a blow and finally hear it coming. She set down her trowel, climbed down the wooden ladder propped against the side of the house with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times, and dropped the last 2 rungs to the ground. She wiped her mortar-covered hands on her apron and looked at him. "They sent someone," she said. "I wondered how long it would take. You knew they were coming." "My father's partner, a man named Delano Fitch, has been sending letters to Santa Fe for 2 months telling them I shouldn't be out here alone," she said. "He wants the land. He thinks if he can get the court to declare me incompetent or incapable of managing the claim on my own, it'll revert to him through the partnership agreement." She met his eyes steadily. "Is that what you've been sent to do? Declare me incapable?" "I've been sent to escort you to Las Cruces," Bernard said, "where you'll board a train to St. Louis. And if I refuse—" Bernard had been in this situation before, or versions of it. He knew the speech. He had given it 100 times. He had given it to weeping widows and frightened homesteaders and angry ranchers, and he had always delivered the people the court wanted delivered. He was a man who finished what he started. He opened his mouth to begin the speech and found, unexpectedly, that something about the way this woman was looking at him, not angry, not frightened, but with a kind of fierce, clear-eyed intelligence that asked him to be honest, made the usual words feel hollow. "Then I'll have to report back to the court that you declined," he said, instead of what he had planned to say. "And they'll send someone else, someone with different instructions." She tilted her head slightly. "You're being honest with me." "I try to be." She studied him for a moment. "Come inside, Mr. Granger. I'll make coffee." The inside of the house was small and spare but thoroughly cared for. There was a cookstove against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow shelf of books that made Bernard look twice, because it was not a thing you saw often in a place like this. Not just a Bible, but actual books, a worn copy of Oliver Twist and what looked like a surveying manual and several volumes he didn't recognize. There was a framed drawing on the wall that he initially took for a store-bought print and then realized, when he looked more closely, had been done by hand, a detailed pencil sketch of the canyon walls to the west, precise and beautiful. "Did you draw that?" he asked. She was at the stove, filling the pot from a pitcher of water. She glanced back at the drawing. "Yes, my father taught me to survey land when I was 12. He said I needed to know how to see a landscape as it actually is, not as it looks." A brief pause. "He was a good man. Mr. Fletcher in town said you buried him mostly on your own." She set the pot on the stove and turned around. "Fletcher talks too much." But her voice wasn't sharp. It was tired. "My father died of a fever. It came on fast and it took him in 4 days. There wasn't much time to arrange things." She sat down at the table. "Sit down, Mr. Granger. You're making me nervous standing there." He sat. "Tell me about these instructions," she said. "All of them, not just the version you give to people you think are going to comply." And because she asked directly, and because he found it was not in him to be anything but honest with someone looking at him like that, he told her. He told her about Delano Fitch's letters, and the court's decision, and the fact that there was a legitimate legal argument being made that the land claim was in dispute, and that her father's partnership agreement with Fitch gave the man certain rights that would be complicated to contest from within the territory without better legal representation than Dusty Creek could offer. He told her that the court's position was that getting her to St. Louis was a kindness, not a punishment, that her uncle's household would provide her stability while matters were settled. She listened to all of it without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her dark eyes steady on his face. When he finished, she said, "And what do you think, Mr. Granger? Not what the court thinks. What do you think?" He thought about it. It was not a question he was often asked. "I think," he said slowly, "that the court is operating on the assumption that you are a woman who needs to be managed, and that assumption may be incorrect." Something that was almost a smile crossed her face. Almost correct. What would make it fully correct? The word may, he said. "I've been here 20 minutes. I don't know you well enough to be certain." She did smile then, and it changed her whole face, made her look younger and more dangerous both at once. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 weeks, she said. "My father's partner has been sending men out here to tell me it's for my own good. The reverend in town told me a woman alone in the territory is an invitation to trouble. 2 men from the next claim overrode by last week and suggested I might want to consider my situation more carefully." Her voice was flat and even throughout all of this, but Bernard could hear the strain underneath it. "Not one of them has asked me what I want." "What do you want?" Bernard asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to keep my father's land," she said. "I want to contest Delano Fitch's claim through proper legal channels, and I want to do it from here, not from my uncle's parlor in St. Louis." She paused. "My uncle is a decent man, but he'll marry me off within 6 months, and that will be the end of it. I'll have no legal standing of my own once I'm a wife. Everything I am will belong to someone else." Bernard had no argument against this. It was true. He knew it was true. The law of 1882 was not particularly kind to women who wanted to stand on their own ground and call it theirs. "I have a job to do, Miss Keating," he said. "I know you do," she said. "And I'm not asking you to break faith with your employers. I'm asking you to think about whether the orders you've been given are right." She looked at him directly. "Is there a difference to you between what's legal and what's right?" It was a question that had followed Bernard Granger for 6 years, hovering at the edge of every job he had taken, every order he had followed, every person he had moved from one place to another on behalf of the territorial court. He had never let himself stop and answer it. He had been too busy being efficient. He looked at her across the small table, with the morning light coming through the single window and the smell of coffee between them, and he said, "Yes, there's a difference." "Good," she said quietly. "Then we can talk." They talked for 3 hours that first morning, longer than Bernard had ever sat with someone he had been sent to collect. She told him about the land, how her father had come to New Mexico territory 10 years ago with nothing but a surveying kit and a stubborn belief that there was something valuable in the red clay soil that people were overlooking. How he had been right. How the land sat over an aquifer that could support real farming in a landscape where everyone assumed only cattle could survive. How Delano Fitch had come in as a partner 4 years ago with money and connections, and how the partnership agreement her father had signed, in good faith, with a man he believed was his friend, contained language that was not what Ezra Keating had thought he was agreeing to. "Your father read the agreement?" Bernard asked. "My father could read a surveying chart better than any man in the territory," Cora said, "but legal documents were not his strength. He trusted Fitch." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I should have read it more carefully. I was there when he signed it. I should have seen." "You were 20 years old," Bernard said. "I was old enough." She said it without self-pity, just a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the thing she carried, and Bernard found this characteristic of hers, the refusal to ask for absolution she didn't feel she had earned, to be something that sat uncomfortably in his chest, not because it troubled him but because it was familiar. It was the same way he had learned to carry his own regrets. He stayed the night. It was too late in the day to start the ride back to town, and she offered him the small lean-to attached to the back of the house that had apparently served as a sleeping room for a hired hand who had left after Ezra Keating's death. Bernard lay on the narrow cot and stared at the dark ceiling and thought about what he was going to do. He was a man who had not deviated from his orders in 6 years, but he had been given those orders on the assumption that Cora Keating was simply a grieving woman who needed to be managed, not a person with a legitimate legal case and a clear-eyed understanding of exactly how and why she was being maneuvered off her own land. He was still thinking about it when he fell asleep. He woke before dawn to the sound of a horse and was on his feet and at the door with his hand on his colt before he had finished coming fully awake. He stepped outside into the gray pre-dawn light and saw Cora standing in the yard, already dressed, holding a lantern and looking out toward the road with an expression of focused alertness that told him this was not the first time she had been woken by riders in the dark. The horse turned out to belong to a man named Pete Reyes, who worked the next claim over and had ridden out through the night to warn Cora that Delano Fitch had arrived in Dusty Creek the previous afternoon with 2 men Bernard would describe as hired muscle. Reyes was a compact, weathered man of about 50 with a calm face and worried eyes who sat his horse in the yard and told them both what he knew in a few short sentences. "Fitch is telling people the court has ordered the property vacated," Reyes said, looking at Bernard with a carefully neutral expression. "He says a man from Santa Fe is coming to collect Miss Keating today and that once she's gone, the property falls under the partnership claim." "That is not what my orders say," Bernard said. "Maybe not," Reyes said, "but it's what Fitch is telling people. And 2 of the men he brought, Corwin and the other one, I don't know his name, they've done work for Fitch before. My wife says the younger one came through here 2 years ago when there was trouble over the Harmon property. The Harmons left in a hurry." He looked at Cora. "I wanted you to know." Cora thanked him, and Reyes rode back into the dark. She turned to look at Bernard. The lantern light was gold against her face, and her expression was not frightened. It was something harder and more complicated than fear. It was the look of someone calculating their options with absolute honesty about how limited they were. "You should know," she said quietly, "that if you take me to Las Cruces today, Fitch will have possession of this property within a week. The partnership agreement is written in language my father's lawyer has told me could be read either way, but a court 1,000 miles from here will read it the way Fitch wants it read. My father spent 10 years on this land." She looked at the dark shape of the house, the garden, the canyon walls turning from black to purple in the first breath of dawn. "He is buried here." Bernard was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said. "Then what are you going to do?" He looked at her. "I need to read the partnership agreement." She stared at him. "You can read legal documents. I worked for a law firm in Denver for 2 years before I took work with the court," he said. "I can read them." She went inside and came back with a folded document that showed the signs of having been read and reread many times, the creases worn soft, the edges slightly frayed. She held it out to him and he took it into the house, sat down at the table and read it carefully by the light of her lamp. It took him an hour. She sat across from him and waited, not talking, occasionally refilling his coffee without being asked. When he finished, he set the document down and looked at her. "He's right that the language is ambiguous," Bernard said. "But there's a clause here in Section 4 that says the partnership dissolves upon the death of either partner unless the surviving partner exercises the buyout option within 30 days of the death." She leaned forward. "I saw that clause." "Fitch's deadline for the buyout option was 12 days ago," Bernard said. "If he missed it, if there is no documented exercise of that option within 30 days of your father's death, the partnership dissolved automatically and the land reverts entirely to your father's estate." Cora stared at him. "Does Fitch know that?" she asked. "I don't think he does," Bernard said. "Or if he does, he's counting on no one catching it before he can get you out of the territory and establish possession." He looked at her steadily. "Do you have dated correspondence with Fitch from the past month? Anything that documents his communications with you?" She was already on her feet, opening a small tin box on the shelf. She pulled out a bundle of letters tied with twine and set them in front of Bernard. He sorted through them with the careful efficiency of a man who knew what he was looking for and found it in the fourth letter. A letter from Fitch dated 33 days after Ezra Keating's death, in which Fitch discussed the property as though the partnership were still in effect and made no mention of any buyout exercise. "He missed it," Bernard said. "He was so focused on getting you removed that he forgot to exercise the option." This letter is evidence that he knew about the partnership dissolution clause and failed to act on it within the required window. Cora sat down slowly, as if her legs had decided they needed a moment to reconsider their position on holding her up. Her hands were flat on the table, and she was looking at the letters with an expression that Bernard found he had to look away from, because the amount of relief and hope and exhausted gratitude in it made something pull sharply behind his breastbone. "This is why you can't take me to Las Cruces," she said. It was not a question and not a demand. It was a statement of logical fact. "This is why I can't take you to Las Cruces," Bernard agreed. "If you leave, this evidence leaves with you or gets lost in the shuffle. You need to get these documents to a lawyer in Santa Fe immediately, before Fitch can take possession and muddy the legal waters." "But you're the man from the court," she said. "If you don't take me," Fitch will say. "Fitch can say whatever he likes," Bernard said. "My orders are to escort you to Las Cruces for your safety and the simplification of the land dispute. I have found information that materially changes the nature of the land dispute. It is within my authority to delay the escort while I report this information to the court." He paused. "That is technically true." A small smile touched her mouth. "Only technically." "Technically is enough to work with," he said, and was surprised to find that he was almost smiling back. They had two problems. The first was that Fitch and his men were in Dusty Creek and would be out at the property by mid-morning. The second was that getting the documentation to Santa Fe quickly enough to matter would require either a fast rider or the telegraph at the station in Mesilla, which was 40 miles east. Bernard made the decision quickly, the way he made all decisions. He assessed what he knew, identified what needed to happen, and chose a course of action. "We ride to Mesilla. We send a telegraph to the court from there with the relevant details, and then we ride to Santa Fe if we need to. I want this documented before Fitch can get to anyone in the court who might be sympathetic to his version of events." "Can I trust the court?" she asked. It was a fair question, and he answered it honestly. "You can trust the process if the right people are looking at the right evidence. The court isn't corrupt, it's just distant and busy and reliant on the information it's given. Right now it's been given Fitch's information. We need to give it yours." She was already packing when he went to saddle the horses. They rode east as the sun came up, the desert going from purple to gold around them, the air still cool and carrying the smell of sage, and something sweet he never could identify in desert mornings, some flower that existed only in that particular quality of early light. Bernard set a steady pace. Not a panicked gallop, but not a stroll either, the purposeful ground-covering pace of a man who knew these distances and knew how to read a horse. Cora rode well. He noticed this, not because he was surprised by it, because he had already revised his initial assumptions about her several times, but because there was something particular about the way she rode, upright and easy in the saddle, watching the landscape with the same careful attention she had given the legal documents. She was a woman who was always fully present in whatever she was doing. They had been riding for about 2 hours when she said, conversationally, "What made you decide to stay last night? You could have taken me to town and had me at the railhead by now." "You asked me the right question," he said. "Which one? Whether there was a difference to me between what's legal and what's right." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "And what's the answer?" "Yes," he said, "there's a difference. And I've been ignoring it for too long." He kept his eyes on the trail. "I've moved a lot of people across this territory on behalf of the court. Some of them deserved moving. Some of them didn't. And I moved them anyway because I told myself it wasn't my job to decide." He paused. You're not the first person I've been sent to collect who had a legitimate reason to stay where they were." She looked at him sideways. "That sounds like a heavy thing to carry." "It is," he said, simply and without dramatics. They rode in silence for a while after that, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who have said something real and are letting it settle. They reached the river crossing at Cimarron Creek around mid-morning. The creek was running higher than usual for late spring, fed by snowmelt from the mountains to the north, and the water was clear and fast-moving over the rocky bed. Bernard had crossed it a dozen times in different seasons, and knew the safest line, a diagonal approach from the northwest bank, to a rock shelf on the southeast side that made the footing reliable. He dismounted to check the depth at the edge, walking the bank with the focused attention of a man who had learned not to trust crossings he hadn't personally verified in the current conditions. The water came to his knee at the deepest point, which was manageable for the horses but cold and fast enough to require care. He came back up the bank and was about to give Cora the line for the crossing when she said, still on horseback, looking at the water with an expression that was thoughtful rather than anxious, "Mr. Granger." "Yes." She looked at him then, and there was something in her face that he could not quite categorize, not flirtatious, not manipulative, not calculated. It was a question she had decided to ask because she genuinely wanted the answer, and the earnestness of it, the complete absence of performance, stopped him cold. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked. "Not the legal explanation, not the technical version. Why are you actually doing this?" The river ran past them. A hawk turned overhead in the wide blue sky. Bernard Granger stood on the bank of Cimarron Creek and looked up at Cora Keating sitting straight and honest on her horse, and felt the answer rise up in him like water finding its level, something he had been carrying since he sat down at her table that morning and heard her speak about her father's land with the steady, fierce love of a person who had given themselves to something completely. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "And because someone should have done it sooner." He looked at the water. "And because you asked me to be honest about it." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected, and she asked nothing more about it. But something had changed between them in the asking and the answering. Some subtle realignment had occurred, and they both felt it, and neither of them spoke it aloud, and they crossed the river. He did not take her to Las Cruces. He rode beside her to Mesilla instead, and at the telegraph station he spent 45 minutes composing the most carefully worded message of his professional career to the territorial court in Santa Fe, outlining the relevant legal details regarding the Fitch partnership agreement, requesting an immediate review of the buyout option clause, and making it formally clear that, in his assessment, the escort to Las Cruces would constitute a material harm to the subject's legitimate legal interests, and was therefore being delayed pending court review. The telegraph operator, an elderly man named Colton who had seen everything in 30 years of relaying messages, read Bernard's draft, looked at Cora, looked at Bernard, and said, "You're going to have an interesting career after this." "I've had an interesting career before this," Bernard said, and pushed the message across the counter. While they waited for a response, they ate lunch at the single eating house in Mesilla, beans and cornbread and coffee, so strong it felt like it had opinions. And Bernard watched Cora hold herself together with the concentrated effort of a person who was not yet certain that the thing they hoped for was going to happen. She ate carefully and methodically, not because she was hungry, he thought, but because eating was something to do with her hands. "Tell me about your father," he said. She looked up. "Why?" "Because you're thinking about whether you're going to lose his land," he said, "and it might help to talk about him instead." A long pause. Then she set down her fork and said, "His name was Ezra. He was 53 years old when he died, which felt too young to me. He came to New Mexico from Ohio when I was 14, after my mother died. He said he needed somewhere big enough to breathe in. He used to say that Ohio was a fine place, but the sky was too small." She looked at her hands. He taught me to survey land and to read maps and to look at a landscape and understand what it was actually telling you, not just what it looked like on the surface. He believed that the land had things to say if you were willing to listen carefully enough. She was quiet for a moment. He would have liked you, I think. He appreciated people who were honest when it cost them something. Bernard didn't know what to say to that. He said, "He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was," she said. "He was also stubborn and occasionally impossible, and he trusted the wrong people and didn't read contracts carefully enough, but I loved him completely." The telegraph response came 2 hours later. It was from a man named Hargrove at the court, a deputy registrar who Bernard had worked with several times, and who was, crucially, not one of the court members Bernard suspected might have sympathies in Fitch's direction. Hargrove's message was terse and official and exactly what Bernard had hoped for: an order for an immediate hold on any property actions related to the Keating-Fitch claim pending review, and a request that Bernard bring both the original documents and the subject to Santa Fe directly. Cora read the message twice. Her hands were not entirely steady. "Santa Fe," she said. "It's 3 days' ride," Bernard said. "I'll get you there safely." She looked at him. "I know you will," she said, and the simplicity of the trust in her voice made something ache in his chest that he did not quite know what to do with. They left Mesilla the next morning, properly provisioned from the general store, dried beef and hardtack and dried apricots, and 2 full canteens apiece and grain for the horses. Bernard had also sent a separate, shorter message to a colleague in Dusty Creek, a deputy named Alvarez whom he trusted, asking him to watch the Keating property and prevent any unauthorized entry until the court's hold was established. It was not a guarantee, but it was something. The ride to Santa Fe took them through country that opened up as they moved north, the desert giving way gradually to higher ground, juniper and pinon appearing in the arroyos, the air getting thinner and cleaner and cooler. They rode together through long afternoons and made camp each night in the careful, practical way of 2 people who understood the wilderness and did not pretend it was something other than what it was. On the first evening, they made camp in a shallow canyon where a spring gave them clean water, and while Bernard built a fire, Cora tended the horses with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. She came back to the fire and sat across from him, and they ate in the comfortable silence that was becoming familiar between them. And Bernard found himself aware, in a way that made him quietly uncomfortable, of the specific way firelight moved across her face, the gold catching in her dark eyes, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was thinking, the way her hands moved when she spoke, always with a kind of purposeful grace. He was not a man who let himself feel things carelessly. He had rules about this. He had reasons for the rules, but Cora Keating was not a woman you could categorize or contain. Every time he thought he understood what she was, she showed him another dimension of herself, and he had to revise. She was grieving and she was fierce. She was practical and she was achingly idealistic. She could name the stars that came out over the desert that first night and also tell you the geological composition of the canyon walls they were camped in, and she could do both in the same breath without any awareness that these were unusual things to know, because for her, they were simply the shape of the world as her father had taught her to see it. "You miss him all the time," Bernard said, that first evening, watching her look at the stars. She didn't ask who he meant. "Every minute," she said. "It's not the kind of missing that comes in waves the way people describe it. It's constant, like a sound that's always in the background." She looked down from the sky. "Does that sound?" "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "You've lost someone." "My mother when I was 19, he said. "Then a partner when I was 24. His name was David Calloway. We worked together for a cattle outfit up near Taos. He was killed in an argument over a water right that wasn't worth anyone's life." He kept his voice level. "I've been moving ever since. I think I was under the impression that if I kept moving, it would eventually stop feeling like something I was running from." "Has it worked?" she asked quietly. "Not particularly," he said. She smiled just slightly and said, "At least you're honest about it." On the second day, they rode through a long stretch of open country where the wind came at them from the west carrying the smell of distant rain, and they talked almost continuously about the territory and its complicated politics, about the railroads and what they were changing, about the Apache band still resisting relocation to the San Carlos reservation, and the injustice of what was being done to people who had lived in this land for longer than any law could claim authority over it. Cora had strong and considered views on this and did not apologize for them, and Bernard found himself listening to her with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely learning something. "My father had Apache neighbors when he first came here," she said. "He treated them with respect and they returned it. When they were forced to move, he wrote letters to the territorial government on their behalf. They were not answered." She paused. "This territory was built on taking from people who were here first and calling it progress. The same thing is happening to smaller landholders now. Fitch and men like him are just the latest version of the same old logic. That land belongs to whoever has the better lawyer, or whoever's willing to be more ruthless," Bernard said. "Which is why having someone with legal knowledge on my side matters enormously," she said and glanced at him sideways. "Thank you for what you know and what you're doing with it. You don't need to thank me." "I want to," she said. "I've been alone in this for 3 months since my father first got sick and I started to understand what Fitch was doing. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know who to ask for help. Having someone who knows what they're doing and who is actually on my side." She stopped. Her voice had gone slightly rough. Bernard looked at the trail ahead and gave her a moment. "I'm on your side," he said after that moment. It was a simple statement of fact, and it was also something more than that, and they both knew it. That evening, they camped at the edge of a pine forest where the altitude had cooled the air enough that they needed their blankets, and the smell of pine resin and wood smoke was something out of a different world than the desert they had come from. Bernard built a larger fire than strictly necessary and Cora sat close to it with her knees drawn up and her eyes on the flames, and he watched her, not discreetly, just watched her because he had stopped pretending that he wasn't. "Tell me something about yourself that isn't about your work," she said, without looking away from the fire. He thought about it. "I used to draw," he said. "When I was young, landscapes mostly. My mother kept a box of my drawings under her bed." A pause. "I stopped when I started moving around. It felt like the wrong thing to carry." She looked at him then, and in her expression he saw the exact quality of attention that she gave to everything, that complete, undefended interest, as if the person in front of her were a landscape she was trying to understand in the way her father had taught her. "Why the wrong thing to carry?" she asked. "Because you draw what you love," he said, "and I didn't want to love things I was going to leave behind." The silence after this was different from the silences before it. It held the weight of what he had just admitted. He hadn't admitted it even to himself exactly, not in those words, not with that much clarity, and the surprise of it was in his own face before he could school it away. Cora said, gently, "Bernard." It was the first time she had used his first name. It landed differently than he expected it to. "I think," she said carefully, as if she were choosing her words with the same attention she gave to a surveying calculation, "that you are a man who has very good reasons for everything he does, and that most of those reasons are a way of protecting yourself from wanting things." And I think she stopped. "Go on," he said. "I think that might be something we have in common," she said, "knowing how to want something from a distance, never quite letting yourself want it close enough to hurt." Bernard was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the forest an owl spoke once and was silent. "That's an accurate description," he said finally. "Yes," she said, and then, after a moment, "I don't want things from a distance anymore. I'm tired of it." He looked at her. She was looking at the fire. The light was warm on her face and her profile was absolute and composed, and he felt something break open in him quietly without drama, the way a creek rises in spring, not a flood, just a steady, inevitable rising. "Cora," he said. She looked at him. I am not going to be a man who says the right thing and then doesn't follow through with it, he said. So I'm not going to say anything I'm not prepared to mean. I know, she said. That's why I said it. She looked back at the fire. We can be quiet for a while, they were. But the quiet was full of something warm and inevitable, and when they settled for sleep on opposite sides of the fire, he lay awake for a long time listening to the night sounds of the forest and feeling, for the first time in years, like something was moving toward him instead of away. They rode into Santa Fe on the third afternoon, coming down from the mountains into the old city with its adobe walls and its Spanish architecture and its particular quality of light, golden and ancient. Santa Fe in 1882 was a city in active transition, still deeply shaped by its Spanish and Mexican heritage, being overlaid by the pressures of territorial American government, and all of it sitting on land that had been Pueblo land before any of the rest. Bernard could feel Cora taking it in, the way she always took in landscapes, with that close and comprehensive attention. The territorial court was housed in a building on the palace of the governor's block, solid and official and slightly imposing. Bernard had been inside it many times. He walked in with Cora beside him and went directly to Hargrove's office, and Hargrove, a small, efficient man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, had clearly been expecting them, because he had documents already spread across his desk and waved them in without preamble. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Bernard presented the partnership agreement, the dated correspondence, and his written analysis of the buyout option clause and Fitch's failure to exercise it. Hargrove read everything with the painstaking attention of a man who had made his career on not missing details. Cora answered questions about dates and communications with a clarity and precision that Bernard watched Hargrove register with visible respect. At the end of the 2 hours, Hargrove removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his handkerchief, replaced them, and said, "Mr. Fitch's claim appears to be legally void. I will need to verify this with the senior registrar and likely a judge, but on the face of the documentation, the buyout option was not exercised within the contractual window, and the partnership dissolved automatically at the time of Ezra Keating's death." He looked at Cora. "That means the land claim belongs entirely to your father's estate, which passes to you as his surviving heir." Cora said nothing for a moment. Her hands were folded in her lap and her face was very still. "How long will the verification take?" she asked. "A week, perhaps 2, Hargrove said. "I would ask that you remain in Santa Fe during that time, Miss Keating. Not as a requirement, you're not a prisoner, but because your presence will expedite things considerably." "Of course," she said. "Thank you." They walked out of the building into the afternoon sun, and Bernard was aware of the slight tremble in Cora's hands as they came down the steps, the way she was holding herself together through what was clearly an enormous effort of will. He walked beside her to the edge of the plaza, and she stopped and stood there with her face turned up to the sky and her eyes closed, and he waited. After a moment she opened her eyes and said, very quietly, "I think it might actually be all right." "I think it might be," he agreed. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were bright and she was not going to cry. He could see that she had made a decision somewhere in the last 3 months about not crying in front of other people, and she was holding to it, but the brightness was enormous. "You turned around at that river crossing," she said. "You didn't take me to Las Cruces. Everything after that started there." "You asked the right question," he said. "I asked why you were really helping me." "Yes. And," she said, and there was something teasing in it, slightly, the first time he had seen her be teasing, and it changed her face into something that made his heart do a thing he was going to have to address. "And I told you the truth," he said. "Part of it," she said. He looked at her. She was smiling, not a small, careful smile, but a real one, full and slightly reckless, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a very long time. "Part of it," he agreed. They found her a room at a respectable boarding house on Guadalupe Street, run by a woman named Mrs. Archuleta, who had no patience for nonsense, and an extremely clean establishment. Bernard had stayed there before and knew it was safe and decent. He got himself a room at an establishment 2 blocks away, and they parted on the street outside Mrs. Archuleta's with a formality that felt slightly absurd given the 3 days they had just spent together in the wilderness, but which was also, in its way, a kind of courtesy, an acknowledgment that the shape of things had changed, and they were both still working out what that meant. During the week that followed, Santa Fe was kind to them. The verification process moved with the steady but unhurried pace of official processes everywhere, and Bernard and Cora found themselves with the strange luxury of time that was not urgent. They walked the city together in the mornings, he showing her the places he knew, the market at the plaza, the old church of San Miguel that was said to be the oldest in the country, the narrow streets of the Spanish Quarter where the houses pressed close and flowering vines climbed the adobe walls. She drew in a small notebook she had bought at the market, quick, precise sketches, and he watched her draw and felt the long dormant part of himself that had once drawn landscapes stir quietly back to life. He bought a pencil and a small bound notebook at the same market stall. She noticed but didn't say anything, only handed him a page she had torn from her own notebook, a sketch of the church they had just come from, done in 5 minutes with the kind of confident line that meant she could really see. He tucked it carefully into his breast pocket. They ate dinner together every evening at a small Mexican restaurant near the plaza, where an older woman named Senora Vega made pozole and red chili that was so good it made conversation temporarily impossible. They talked about everything, books and maps, and the nature of the law and the future of the territory, and what Cora planned to do with the land once it was confirmed as hers. She had plans that were detailed and practical and ambitious. The aquifer development, a small orchard she had been thinking about for 2 years, possibly a partnership with the Reyes family next door for shared water management. "You've been planning this for a long time," Bernard said. "My whole life, in a way," she said. "My father and I used to talk about what the land could be. He would never have thought of it as just a cattle range. He wanted to grow things." She looked down at her pozole. "I want to finish what he started." "You will," Bernard said. She looked at him. "You say that with a great deal of certainty." "I've watched you for a week," he said. "I've seen you navigate the territorial court, cross a flooded river, build a legal case from scratch, and eat the hottest chili in Santa Fe without flinching. I don't have any doubt." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh properly, a real, unguarded sound that startled him with how much he wanted to hear it again. "The chili is the hardest part," she said. "I'll grant you that." On the 5th day, Bernard received word from his colleague Alvarez in Dusty Creek that Fitch had arrived at the property with his men and attempted to take possession, been turned back by Alvarez citing the court's hold order, and had then retreated to town in a fury. Fitch's reaction to the court's hold, as reported by Alvarez, was to send another round of letters to Santa Fe attempting to have the hold lifted. Those letters arrived at the court and were reviewed by Hargrove, who filed them under the heading of supporting documentation for the original case and sent Fitch a formal notification that the matter was under review. Fitch, according to Alvarez's next message, had not taken this calmly. Bernard reported all of this to Cora, who received it with the focused attention she gave everything. "Will he try something else?" she asked. "Men like Fitch have certain moves," Bernard said. "Legal pressure is the first one. When that fails, they try to find leverage, something personal, something that can be used to complicate the situation. Since we're here and the property is guarded, his options are limited." He paused. "When the court rules in your favor, he'll probably leave. The legal game will be over and there won't be enough profit in continuing to fight it. And if they don't rule in my favor—" "They will," he said. "The clause is clear, Hargrove is thorough, and I intend to be in the room when the decision is made." She looked at him for a moment and then said quietly, "You're still doing this." "What?" "Standing between me and the things that want to take what's mine," she said. "You were sent to move me out of the way, and instead you've spent 2 weeks making sure I have somewhere to stand." He didn't know what to say. She was watching him with those dark eyes that saw everything, and what she was seeing was something he hadn't entirely organized his feelings about yet, something that was still in the process of becoming real to him. The fact that this woman had changed the shape of his life in a way that he was only beginning to fully understand. "I told you," he said. "I'm on your side." "I know," she said. "I also know that this started as a job, and I know it isn't just a job anymore. I'm not asking you to tell me what it is now. She stopped. Then more quietly, "I just wanted to say that I see it, whatever it is." He looked at her for a long time. The Santa Fe afternoon light was golden and everything was very still. "Cora," he said. "Yes. I need to tell you something." She waited. "When I first got your address and rode out to Dusty Creek," he said, "I had every intention of being efficient and professional and getting you on a train inside 3 days. I was going to be in Las Cruces by Tuesday and back in Santa Fe by Thursday, and I was going to file a report and move on to the next job." He paused. "And then you were on the roof." She tilted her head slightly, and the corner of her mouth curved. "We're on the roof of your house at dawn, patching the mortar, 3 weeks after burying your father alone, and you looked down at me and told me to state my business before you'd even come down the ladder," he said. "And I thought, this is a person who is completely herself. No part of her is performing or pretending or asking for permission." He looked at his hands. "I haven't met many people like that. I'm not sure I've been a person like that." "You've been honest with me," she said, "since the first day." "Because you made it impossible to be anything else," he said. "You asked questions that required real answers." "I always ask real questions," she said. "Most people don't like it." "I know," he said. "I liked it very much." The silence after this was the warmest silence he had ever sat in, and it went on for a long time, and at the end of it she reached across the restaurant table and put her hand over his, just briefly, just for a moment, and the warmth of it went through him like the first real fire after a long cold. Hargrove delivered the court's ruling 9 days after they had arrived in Santa Fe. He summoned them both to his office in the mid-morning and read the ruling in his careful, unhurried way. The Keating-Fitch partnership was deemed dissolved as of the date of Ezra Keating's death, as no buyout option had been exercised within the contractual window. The land claim was confirmed in its entirety as the property of the estate of Ezra Keating, to pass to his sole heir and surviving relative, Cora Marguerite Keating. Fitch's subsequent claims were invalid. The hold was converted to a permanent protection order pending Fitch's acknowledgement of the ruling. Hargrove also noted, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously official and gently pointed, that the original court order to escort Miss Keating to Las Cruces had been premised on incomplete information and was now void. When they walked out of the building this time, Cora stopped on the steps and turned to Bernard and said, "It's mine." "It's yours," he confirmed. She pressed her hands flat against her sternum as if she were trying to hold something in, and he saw the full force of the relief break across her face. 3 months of terror and grief and fighting and exhaustion all releasing at once, and it was not quiet or contained. She turned away from the street and put her face in her hands and breathed through it, and Bernard stood close to her and said nothing, and after a moment she lifted her face and it was wet and she was smiling with a brightness that had no roof on it. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't apologize," he said. She looked at him. "Come home with me," she said. "Not, I mean," she laughed slightly, still tearful, slightly undone. "Come back to Dusty Creek with me. Help me open the house back up properly. I don't want to do it alone, and I'm not ready to say goodbye yet." "Neither am I," he said. They rode back south together, a longer route than the one they had come by, because Bernard knew a canyon road that was not faster but was, in his judgment, worth experiencing. They came down through it in the early afternoon of the second day of the return journey, the canyon walls going from gold to red to deep rust as the sun moved, and Cora stopped her horse in the middle of the trail and sat there for a full 3 minutes, looking up at the walls, and then pulled out her notebook and drew. He watched her draw and thought about the long, specific shape of the last 2 weeks and understood with complete clarity that he did not want to leave. Not just Dusty Creek, not just Cora's company on the road, but the entirety of what his life had become in these 14 days. The having of someone to ride toward, the sound of her voice in the mornings before she was fully awake, when she talked at half volume about whatever she had been thinking, the way she gave her complete attention to anything that interested her, the way she had of knowing when to be quiet. He had been moving for 6 years, and he had told himself that it was a preference, that he was a man who was better in motion than stationary. He was discovering, slowly, that what he had actually been was lonely, and that he had been moving because moving made the loneliness bearable, and that what made the loneliness stop was not any destination, but the specific presence of this specific woman. He thought about this carefully, because he was a careful man, and he considered whether it was too fast or too real, or whether he was projecting onto the circumstances something that belonged only to the drama of the last 2 weeks. He considered this honestly and concluded that it wasn't. It was not the drama. It was her, the actual her, the woman on the roof and at the table and at the river crossing, asking real questions. He had been paying attention for 2 weeks, and this was what the attention had found. They made camp that night at the base of the canyon, and after dinner, sitting by the fire, she handed him her notebook, open to the page she had been drawing on that afternoon. The canyon walls were there, exact and beautiful, every straight a line precisely rendered, and in the foreground, very small, 2 figures on horseback looking up at the walls together. He looked at the drawing for a long time. "You put us in it," he said. "The scale was interesting," she said, and she was looking at the fire and not at him, but the edge of her profile was smiling. He reached into his own jacket pocket and took out the small notebook he had bought at the market in Santa Fe. He had been drawing in it, quietly, at odd moments, not the practiced work she did, but the tentative first efforts of a man reclaiming a lost habit. He opened it to the page he had filled 3 days ago and handed it to her. It was her, at the fire in the pine forest on the second night, with her knees drawn up and her face turned to the flames. He had drawn it from memory, and it was imperfect, the line not as confident as it should have been, but it was undeniably, entirely her, the particular angle of her head, the way her hands wrapped around each other, the quality of complete focus. She held the notebook and looked at the drawing for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Bernard." "Yes." She looked up at him, and her eyes were very bright and very direct. "I told you I was tired of wanting things from a distance." "You did," he said. "I meant that," she said. He held her gaze. The fire moved between them, and the stars were enormous overhead, and the canyon held them in its quiet red walls. "Cora," he said, and his voice was lower than he intended, "I don't have a plan past getting you home safely. I resigned from the court this morning by letter. I sent it from the last town." He paused. "So I don't have a job or a place to be or a reason to keep moving." She stared at him. "You resigned." "I resigned." "Bernard," she said, and now she sounded almost exasperated and also something else entirely. "When were you going to tell me?" "Now," he said. "I'm telling you now." "Why did you resign?" she asked, though from her face he thought she might already know. "Because I am done moving people around the territory against their will," he said. "And because the man I was doing it for, the version of me who thought efficiency was the same as integrity, he's not who I want to be anymore." He looked at her directly. "And because I wanted to have a reason to ask if there is any use for a man with some legal knowledge and middling carpentry skills, and a determination not to run any more at a small homestead outside Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory." The silence was total. Then Cora Keating smiled so completely, and with such unguarded joy, that it was like watching the sun come over a canyon rim, and she said, "I need someone to help me build a second room." They arrived in Dusty Creek 3 days later, in the late afternoon, the light going golden and long across the desert. Reyes was there at the edge of the Keating property, having ridden over when he saw the dust of their approach, and he met them with the careful reserve of a man trying not to presume. But when Cora told him the land was confirmed and the court had ruled in her favor, he took off his hat and held it over his heart with a simple dignity that made the moment feel large. Your father would be glad, Reyes said. Yes, Cora said, he would. Fletcher at the general store heard the news within an hour and came out to offer congratulations with a warmth that made Bernard revise his earlier assessment of the man who talked too much. The town was small and it was watching, the way small towns always watch new things, and Bernard felt the assessment of him move through the community's peripheral awareness. The court man who had come to remove their neighbor and had instead helped her keep her land. He did not need their approval, but he was aware that in a place this small, the community's willingness to accept a newcomer mattered. It was Reyes who made it easier in the simple way of a man who acted from his values rather than his calculations. He shook Bernard's hand and asked plainly if Bernard intended to stay, and when Bernard said yes, Reyes nodded once and said, "Good. There's too much work out here for one person. My wife will come over Saturday with tamales." And that was that. In the days that followed, there was a great deal of work. The house needed attention, not from neglect, because Cora had been maintaining it with fierce determination, but because two people living in it required different arrangements than one. Bernard had not been exaggerating about his carpentry skills. He had learned them in his Denver years, and they were functional if not inspired. He and Cora worked together on the second room, which had been the lean-to and needed proper walls and a floor, and the work was good. The kind of straightforward physical labor that asks only that you pay attention and move steadily, and gives back a tangible result at the end of each day. There was a morning 2 weeks after their return when they were working side by side on the interior wall of the new room, Cora mixing plaster and Bernard applying it to the frame, when she said, without looking up from her work, "Delano Fitch left the territory." "When?" "Alvarez sent word yesterday. He took his men and rode for El Paso." She was quiet for a moment. "He didn't fight the ruling. He knew the legal ground wasn't there," Bernard said. "Men like Fitch pick fights they think they can win. Once the court ruled, there was nothing left for him here." "I know," she said. She set down her bucket and wiped her hands. "I've been afraid of him for 3 months. It feels strange to have it just be over." Bernard set down his trowel and looked at her. "Is it strange or is it relief?" She considered this. "Both," she said, "mostly relief." She looked at him and a smile broke through, the reckless full one that he had become very familiar with and could not stop wanting to see. Mostly relief." He stepped toward her and she did not step back, and he took her face in both his hands the way you hold something you understand the value of completely, and he kissed her. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, no coyness, no pretense, just the complete and honest presence of herself. And when they stepped apart, her eyes were bright and her smile was enormous, and she said, "You took long enough." "I wanted to be sure," he said. "And are you?" "Absolutely," he said. Summer came on and the land bloomed in the way Cora had always known it could. The garden was the largest she had ever planted, and Bernard had come to understand the aquifer in the way that Ezra Keating had understood it, as a living thing, a resource that required respect and knowledge and careful use. He rode out to Mesilla for surveying equipment and spent 2 weeks mapping the water table with Cora's guidance, and the map they produced together was, she said, the best thing she had ever seen for understanding what the land could support. Reyes's wife, Maria, came with tamales on that first Saturday and came back the following week and the week after. And the friendship that developed between the two women was something Bernard was grateful for in a way he hadn't anticipated. Cora had been so alone in her grief and her fighting, and to see her laugh at Maria's kitchen table with the ease of a person who felt safe was something he thought about at odd moments during the day with a warmth that surprised him with its intensity. There was an evening in July when they sat on the step of the house after dinner, the desert cooling around them and the first stars coming out, and Cora leaned her shoulder against Bernard's and said, "I want to show you something tomorrow." "All right," he said. She took him the next morning to the west end of the property, where the canyon walls rose close, and the rock showed its strata in long horizontal lines of red and cream and dark brown. There was a place here where a shallow overhang created a natural shelter, and on the back wall of the overhang, protected from the weather, were petroglyphs, figures, and symbols carved into the stone by people who had been in this place long before Ezra Keating and long before Delano Fitch, and long before the territorial court in Santa Fe had ever thought to claim jurisdiction over any of it. Cora stood in front of the carvings with her hands at her sides and a particular expression that was quiet and serious. "My father found these the first year he was here," she said. "He never told anyone because he was afraid of what it would mean that someone would want to study them or take possession of the site." She looked at the carvings. "He thought they should be left alone, that the people who put them there had more claim to this ground than anyone else ever would." Bernard looked at the carving's spirals, deer, a figure that might have been a person with arms raised, a long line of marks that might have been a calendar. "He was right," he said. "I've been thinking about what it means to own land," Cora said. "Legally, this is mine now, but these were here before ownership was a concept that applied to this place. My father knew that. He was careful about how he used the land because of it. And you'll be careful the same way," Bernard said. "I will," she said. "I've been thinking about writing it down, the location, the carvings, a record of what's here. Not to claim it, but to document it in case the people whose ancestors carved this ever want to know where it is." She paused. "Would that be overstepping?" "I think it would be the right kind of record," he said. "The kind that preserves instead of claims." She looked at him and then she looked back at the carvings, and her expression was the settled, clear expression of someone who has decided something. "Good," she said. "I'll start drawing them this week." He helped her. They spent 3 mornings at the overhang, Cora sketching the carvings in precise detail while Bernard measured and noted the dimensions and orientation of the site. And the pages they produced were quiet and careful and felt like the right thing, which was, he had come to understand, the feeling Cora trusted above all other feelings. In August, Bernard rode to Mesilla and sent a letter to a lawyer he had known in Denver, a man named Ostrowski who had a reputation for taking cases the territorial courts tried to ignore. He described the situation with the Pueblo and Apache communities in the territory, the ongoing land dispossession, the legal mechanisms that were being used, and asked Ostrowski whether any of it was challengeable through proper legal channels. Ostrowski's reply came 3 weeks later, long, detailed, and genuinely engaged. It was the beginning of a correspondence that would continue for years. He told Cora about it one evening over supper, slightly hesitant, not sure if it was something she wanted to know about or something that belonged to a different part of his life. She set down her fork and looked at him with an expression so warm and direct that he felt it in his chest. "You're using what you know," she said. "Trying to," he said. "That's what knowledge is for," she said. "That's the only reason to have it." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they sat like that for a while with the evening light coming through the window and the desert going quiet outside. He proposed to her in September, at the river crossing where she had asked him her question. He had thought about where to do it for a long time, and it had seemed, in the end, like the only place that made sense. The place where everything had started, where the direction of both their lives had bent toward something new. He had brought no ring yet because a ring was a thing to choose together, and he had decided that everything going forward would be chosen together because that was who they were. He dismounted at the bank of Cimarron Creek and she dismounted beside him and looked at the water for a moment and then looked at him. "You brought me back here," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she asked, but she was smiling. "Because this is where you asked me a real question and got a real answer," he said. "And I want everything between us to work that way." He took her hands. "Cora Keating, I was sent to move you out of the territory, and instead you moved me. You changed every single thing I thought I knew about who I was and what I was doing. I want to spend the rest of my life building something with you. Not moving, building." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him with those steady dark eyes, and the river ran behind her and the sky was enormous, and she said, "Yes. Obviously yes. I told you 2 months ago I was tired of wanting things from a distance." He laughed and she laughed, and he kissed her at the edge of the water with the autumn sun on both of them, and it felt like the most right thing he had ever done. They were married in November at the small adobe church in Dusty Creek, by the same reverend who had told Cora that an unmarried woman in the territory was an invitation to trouble. The reverend had the grace to look slightly abashed when he said the words that made them husband and wife, and Cora, to her enormous credit, did not say anything about it, only smiled with the serenity of a woman who had won something she had fought hard for and could afford to be generous. Maria Reyes cried, which made the reverend's wife cry, which made Fletcher's wife cry, and Fletcher himself stood in the back of the church looking gruff and pleased in equal measure. Pete Reyes stood up with Bernard as his witness. Cora had written a letter to her uncle in St. Louis informing him of her marriage and the outcome of the land case, and the uncle had written back a reply that was simultaneously relieved and impressed, and had sent a gift of cash that Cora promptly designated for the orchard. The first trees went in that winter, apple and pear, which the horticulturalists everyone consulted said had no business growing in that soil and that climate, and which therefore Cora was determined to make grow. She researched soil amendments and talked to anyone she could find who had tried to grow orchard fruit in the high desert, and she developed a method that was essentially her father's approach to the land applied to fruit trees. Pay close attention, respond to what you actually see rather than what you expect to see, and refuse to accept conventional wisdom as the final word. The trees did not die. In the spring, they put out leaves. Bernard, watching this, wrote a long letter to his mother's grave, or rather, to the memory of his mother, which amounted to the same thing, describing where he was and who he was with, and saying that he thought she would have liked Cora Keating very much. He didn't tell Cora he had written it. She found out anyway because she found the pages on the table when he had gone out to check the fences, and she read them, and when he came back she said nothing, only looked at him steadily with bright eyes until he understood that she knew, and then she said, "She would have liked you too, I think, the you that you are now. Not the you I was before," he said. That Bernard was doing his best, she said, but he hadn't found what he needed yet. He pulled her close and held her with the complete, uncomplicated certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is supposed to be. Cora was expecting their first child by the following spring. She continued working through most of the pregnancy with the practical efficiency that characterized everything she did, modifying tasks rather than abandoning them, directing Bernard in the heavier work with precise instructions and no sentimentality. She also continued documenting the petroglyphs, which had expanded into a larger project. She had been corresponding with a professor in Albuquerque who was interested in the site and who had connections to Pueblo communities in the region. Through him, she had made contact with an elder from a nearby Pueblo who came to see the site and spent an afternoon looking at the carvings with an expression of profound recognition. He told Cora, through the professor who translated, that the symbols were consistent with those made by ancestors of his people several hundred years ago, and that it was unusual and moving to find that the person living on this land had protected the site rather than destroying it. He asked if he might bring others from his community to see it. Cora said yes without hesitation. Bernard was present for these visits, standing quiet and respectful at the edge of things, while the elder and the others who came after him spent time at the overhang. He thought about the long chain of occupancy that this land represented, the people who had carved the stone, and the Spanish who had come after, and his own people who had come after them, and the ongoing, complicated question of what it meant to own a place and what you owed to the people who had been there before you. He thought about this carefully and discussed it with Cora in the evenings, and they arrived together at a position that felt honest. They would use this land with care, share access to the site with the communities who had prior connection to it, document everything they could, and never mistake legal title for moral superiority. it was not a complete answer. Bernard knew there were no complete answers to questions that large, but it was the best attempt at honesty they could manage, and attempting honestly felt like the right starting place. Their son was born on a Tuesday morning in early May of 1884 at the homestead, delivered by Maria Reyes, who had been midwife to half the babies in the county. He was loud and red-faced and absolutely healthy, and they named him Ezra James Granger, Ezra for Cora's father, James for Bernard's, both men dead and deserving of a name that would move through the world after them. Bernard held his son in the afternoon of that first day, sitting in the chair by the window with the desert light coming in and Cora asleep in the bed behind him, and he looked at the small absolute fact of this new person and felt something so large and quiet that he couldn't have named it if he'd tried. He thought about the man he had been 2 years ago, moving across the territory on efficient and professional horseback, delivering people from one place to another and never stopping long enough to let anything matter. He looked at the baby and thought, here is the thing that made staying worth it. Here is what happens when you stop running long enough to let the right question reach you. The orchard bloomed for the first time that spring, apple blossoms opening in the high desert air like a small, impossible miracle. And Cora stood in the middle of it with the baby on her hip and her head tilted back to look at the flowers against the blue sky. Bernard stood at the edge of the orchard and watched her and drew them, his wife and his son in the blooming trees, the canyon walls rising red in the background, the whole particular beauty of the thing they had made. And this time the drawing was sure and clear and exactly right, because his hand was not the hand of a man who was protecting himself from loving the thing he was drawing. He filled the page and turned to a new one and started again. The years settled into each other with the pleasant accumulation of a life being lived rather than endured. Bernard's correspondence with Ostrowski led to him doing consulting work for cases involving land rights in the territory, not writing for the court anymore, but writing careful legal analyses from his desk at the homestead, applying the knowledge he had spent 6 years accumulating in service of efficiency to a more considered and humane purpose. The work was not glamorous, but it was useful, and twice it contributed to rulings that prevented the wrongful dispossession of small landholders who had less legal leverage than they deserved. He taught himself to be a better carpenter because the house needed more rooms as the family grew. He and Reyes built a proper barn together in the summer of 1885, the two men working in easy companionable silence or conversation as the mood struck, and the barn was solid and well-proportioned and lasted many decades after both of them were gone. Cora's aquifer project became something that other landholders in the region came to look at. Her method of managed water use was not new in principle. It drew on techniques that had been used in the region for centuries. But her approach of combining it with careful surveying and documentation gave it a credibility in the language that territorial authorities understood, and she presented her findings. Over Bernard's expressed admiration and Pete Reyes's barely concealed amazement, to a meeting of the County Land Association in Mesilla in the fall of 1885. The men in the room were not accustomed to being educated by a woman, and some of them showed it, and Cora presented her information anyway with the complete composure of someone who has decided that other people's discomfort with her competence is not her problem. Bernard, sitting in the back of the room, thought he might burst with pride, which he recognized as a sentimental reaction and did not apologize for. They had 2 more children, a daughter, Clara, born in 1886, and another son, Thomas, born in 1888. The homestead had grown with them, the additional rooms Bernard had built accommodating the expanding family, the garden expanded and the orchard producing now in earnest. Ezra, the eldest, grew up knowing the land the way his grandfather had taught his mother to know it, as a living system with things to say if you listened carefully. He could identify aquifer signs before he could read, and was helping with the surveying by the time he was 8. Clara inherited Cora's exacting eye and Bernard's reclaimed love of drawing, and she covered every surface she could reach with pencil sketches from the time she could hold a pencil. Thomas was the one who wanted to know how everything worked mechanically. The pump, the wagon, the rifle mechanism that Bernard kept carefully on a high shelf, and he dismantled and reassembled things with a focused curiosity that made Bernard think he would be an engineer of some kind if the world cooperated. The territory of New Mexico moved toward statehood in these years, slowly, and with the characteristic struggle of a place that contained too many competing claims to move smoothly in any direction. Bernard watched the political process with informed attention and wrote occasional pieces for the territorial newspaper under his own name, arguing for the legal recognition of long-standing land claims and the proper documentation of water rights before statehood created a new round of legal chaos. Some of these pieces were well received. Some were not. He kept writing them. Cora kept her father's grave on the west side of the property and planted a desert willow over it that grew into something beautiful over the years, its lavender flowers coming every summer in a color that neither of them had ever seen anywhere else in quite that shade. She visited the grave most evenings in good weather, not to grieve exactly, or not only to grieve, but to keep the conversation going, to tell Ezra Keating what his land was doing, what his grandchildren were learning, what the orchard had put out that season. Bernard sometimes went with her and sometimes gave her the time alone, and he had learned over the years to understand which the day required, because he had spent 15 years paying close attention to his wife. On an evening in the summer of 1897, 15 years after Bernard Granger had ridden into Dusty Creek with orders to put Cora Keating on a train to Missouri, they sat on the step of the house that had grown from a single room with a lean-to into a proper home with a porch and a garden and an orchard and a barn and 3 children inside it in various stages of sleeping. The desert air was warm and smelled of sage and the night-blooming flowers that Cora had planted along the fence line, and the stars were doing what stars in New Mexico always did, which was to fill the sky with a lavishness that made the idea of limits seem like somebody else's problem. Cora was leaning against Bernard's shoulder, in the way she had of settling into a space as if she had always been going to be there, and he had his arm around her, and was drawing with his free hand, not looking at the page, just moving the pencil, and what appeared on the page was the canyon walls and the desert and the silhouette of the orchard trees, and 2 people on a step who had been in each other's lives long enough to have become the most familiar landscape either of them knew. "I was thinking today," Cora said, "about the river crossing. Were you? I asked you why you were really helping me," she said, "and you told me about the difference between legal and right." She paused. "But that wasn't the whole answer either, was it? Even then?" "No," he said, "even then." "What was the rest of it?" she asked. She tilted her face up to look at him, and in the moonlight she was exactly herself. No year had taken anything from the particular quality of her attention, the directness of her gaze, the way she asked real questions and required real answers. He looked at her and felt the full accumulated weight of 15 years. Ezra's birth and Clara's laugh and Thomas, taking apart the pump at age 5 and the orchard in flower, and the petroglyphs and the legal briefs and the long companionable evenings and the arguments and the laughter and the grief that had found its way into the fabric of their life too, as it always did, as it does in every real life. And beneath all of it, the constant ground of it, the fact of her. "Even at the crossing," he said, "I already knew I was not going to leave you behind. I hadn't admitted it yet, but it was already true." He looked down at her. "Because I had been paying attention for 2 days and I had already understood that you were the most entirely yourself person I had ever met, and I didn't want to move away from that." He paused. "I had been moving away from things for 6 years. I didn't want to do it anymore." She was quiet for a moment. The desert breathed around them. "You never did leave," she said. "Not once." "No," he said. I never did." She tucked herself closer against him, and he put his face against the top of her head, and the night was enormous and full, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be: the children inside the house, the orchard in the dark, the canyon walls holding the moonlight, the grave with its desert willow, the property that had been Ezra Keating's vision, and was now the fullest expression of everything he had hoped for, tended by his daughter and the man she had remade by asking the right questions. Bernard set down the pencil and held her with both arms, and the drawing on the page lay where it had fallen, face up in the warm night air. The two of them on the step, the house behind them, the stars above, everything caught and held in the particular kind of stillness that exists only when nothing is missing. He had been sent to take her away, and he had stayed instead, and in the staying he had become the truest version of himself he had ever managed: not efficient, not careful, not protected, but fully present, fully in love, fully home. The river ran on somewhere in the dark. The orchard stood in its patient rows. The stars made their ancient and indifferent arguments overhead. Bernard Granger held his wife on the porch of the house they had built together and drew no more that night, because some things do not need to be recorded. They are simply lived, fully and without reservation, for as long as the gift of them lasts. And in this case, it lasted the rest of their lives.